Hi, and welcome back to Heimlich's History. So we've been hanging out in the progressive era for some time, and we've been seeing how the progressives wanted to use the power of the federal government to right the wrongs of American society in the 1900s. And in this lecture, we hit the apex, the pinnacle, the acme, the apogee, the zenith of progressivism in the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. So let's get to it.
It's time to kick it old school.
Now, Woodrow Wilson was kind of a stuffy, learned academic type guy who did not possess the charisma or the electricity of personality of somebody like Teddy Roosevelt. And by Wilson's own admission, quote, "Roosevelt appeals to the voters' imagination. I do not. He is a real, vivid person whom they have seen and shouted themselves hoarse over and voted for millions strong. I am a vague, conjectural personality, more made up of opinions and academic prepossessions than of human traits and red corpuscles." And somebody didn't say that about Woodrow Wilson. That is his own opinion of himself. But even though Wilson didn't believe that he possessed an abundance of human traits, he did believe, like Roosevelt, in the vigorous use of executive power. And so when Wilson took office in 1913, he set out to attack what he considered the triple wall of privilege, namely tariffs, banks, and trusts. Okay, first, tariffs. The first thing Wilson did in office was to call a special joint session of Congress, and although it was a tradition dating back to Thomas Jefferson that the president would send over his message to Congress to be read by a clerk, Wilson showed up personally and delivered a stunning speech on tariff reform. And almost immediately, Congress passed the Underwood tariff, which drastically reduced the tariff rates. And at the news of this, lobbyists came in to try to tear apart the bill like wild animals, and Wilson appealed to the people saying, "Hey, get your representatives in order." And they did. The second wall of privilege that Wilson attacked was banks. You see, as Wilson saw it, America's currency and banking system had fallen far behind America's industrial growth, and therefore the commerce system was no longer adequate to handle the new realities which Americans were facing. So on this count, Wilson persuaded Congress to pass the Federal Reserve Act. And to explain all the details of what this means would be more than I can do right now, but suffice to say that what happened when the Federal Reserve Act was passed was that monetary policy was put squarely in the hands of the federal government, to the great consternation of Republicans everywhere. The third wall of privilege that Wilson attacked was trusts. Standing on the shoulders of the OG trust buster Teddy Roosevelt, Wilson slashed away further at corporate trusts than even Teddy Roosevelt had. And the major legislation here is called the Clayton Antitrust Act. And basically what this did is made a lot of things that businesses did back then unlawful, like price discrimination and false advertising. Now, while all of this was going on domestically here in America, way across the sea in Europe, there was a great thunderhead building and gathering steam. In July of 1914, a Serbian fellow by the name of Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and with that tiny little spark, Europe exploded into what they called the Great War, and what would later be known as World War I. And to that end, Wilson issued a proclamation of international neutrality. But as Wilson soon discovered, neutrality would be impossible to maintain for several reasons. First, since we were neutral, we found it altogether appropriate to continue our trade relationships with countries on both sides of this war. But Britain didn't like that we were trading with Germany, and Germany didn't like that we were trading with Britain, so Britain started detaining our ships going to Germany, and Germans started sinking our ships going to Britain. And that was very annoying. Second, and related to that, is the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a British passenger ship, and when the Germans sank it, they sank nearly 1,200 civilians with it, including 128 Americans. Now, all of this was extraordinarily vexing to Wilson and to the rest of America, but it could not get us into the war. That is, until the leader of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm, sent a little note to Mexico, which became known as the Zimmerman Note. You see, what Wilhelm understood is that if the United States entered the war, then Germany would be quickly overwhelmed by the fresh supply of new troops. So the Kaiser sent a little note to Mexico, which said, "How about you start a war with the United States?" Oh, thank you. Award for the worst accent in the history of Heimlich's History. Well, the Americans intercepted this note and then published it to the great fury of the American public. And add to that even more German submarines sinking American merchant ships, and that's when you get Woodrow Wilson not a month later walking into Congress and asking for a declaration of war, and they gave it to him. And that's the story of how America, fiercely committed to its independence and avoidance of European entanglements, and especially European wars, got involved in World War I. And in the next lecture, we'll see what became of America in all this craziness. I'll see you next time.